1 year ago today, a violent mob stormed the U.S. Capitol, urged on by then-President Donald Trump, who told them the 2020 election was stolen from him and they should, quote, fight like hell or you're not going to have a country anymore. That day, lawmakers were to certify Joe Biden as the winner of the 2020 presidential election. That work was interrupted as protesters overran police, battering their way into the Capitol building. 5 people died due to the January 6th riots at the U.S. Capitol. More than 140 police officers were injured. Minnesota Representative Dean Phillips was in the U.S. Capitol that day. He joins me now to share his memories of a year ago. Congressman, welcome.
Good to be with you, Kathy.
The photos, the video that were taken and recorded that day show such a surreal situation. And since you were inside the Capitol at the time, what mental images or sounds that day still stick with you?
Well, Kathy, there are so many, starting with moments of disbelief that, frankly, continue 1 year later, and I'm sure shared by many listeners and most Americans. Disbelief that what transpired 1 year ago today happened in the United States of America. The first time in our remarkable history that Americans stormed their own capital. And when I reflect on the sights and sounds, the sight from the Capitol windows towards the National Mall and seeing thousands of soon-to-be insurrectionists marching to the Capitol, the sound of a scream of a U.S. Capitol Police lieutenant who implored that my colleague and I get away from the window and immediately return to the chamber, the sound of the Sergeant-at-Arms getting on the microphone in the House chamber, screaming at us to take cover and put on our smoke hoods, that there was tear gas in the rotunda and they were coming for us. Sounds of the mechanical fans in the smoke hoods, the sound that those of us in the chamber that day will probably never forget. The sound of breaking glass and moving furniture against doors, and of course the sound of a gunshot, just as many of us escaped the chamber to exit to a safe room. Those are sights and sounds that surely will live with all of us.
As the rotunda was being evacuated, do you remember shouting, "This is because of you," at Arizona Republican Paul Gosar? Do you remember that moment?
Absolutely. I'm not someone who likes to break decorum. I wish to be respectful and thoughtful. But I have to say, when I saw Paul Gosar at the microphone just as the insurrection was beginning and the Capitol had been breached, I think I spoke for tens of millions when I screamed, "This is because of you." And to this very day, Kathy, I hold him and a handful of others directly responsible for the events of that day and the challenges we now face.
Have you ever talked to him about that day?
Never. Kathy, there are just a very small handful of people with whom I simply will not congregate or converse with, and he is one of them. And that's a very short list because I make it my mission to always be a voice of reason and to listen to different perspectives, even when I disagree. But I have to say there are a handful of people that are not worthy of that.
Many of your fellow members of Congress have said they suffer from PTSD because of the attack on the Capitol. Do you know some of them? Have you experienced that yourself?
I have, Kathy, and as someone who had never experienced trauma as I did that day, and I recognize it was about 20 minutes of fear. At that time, we did not know what would transpire. Many of us, including myself, thought that the best case scenario may be to be taken hostage, God forbid worse. And I've developed a great sense of empathy for those who've experienced trauma, childhood trauma, trauma from violent incidents, in a way that I never had understood before. And yes, I know many members of Congress, many of my dearest friends and colleagues, journalists and reporters and photographers who were there that day, Capitol staff members, many of whom are in their early 20s and optimistic and hopeful, and extraordinary public servants who were forever scarred by the events of that day, who many of whom have quit because of their fear of returning to the very place where this all happened. I've become more empathetic, and I've got a group of about 25 colleagues who were with me that day. We call ourselves the Gallery Group, and we correspond almost every day. We break bread together, and we've had counseling sessions together, including one just 2 nights ago. And we'll continue that because we have to find a way to reconcile, understand, and most importantly, start building some bridges to decency and respect and shared interest in preserving this remarkable experiment in democracy.
I was thinking a month after January 6th, you gave a speech in which you said the events of the insurrection gave you a window into something you hadn't fully understood until that time. I'm going to play that clip of tape.
Recognizing that we were sitting ducks in this room as the chamber was about to be breached, I screamed to my colleagues to follow me across the aisle to the Republican side of the chamber so that we could blend in. For I felt that the insurrectionists who were trying to break down the doors right here would spare us if they simply mistook us for Republicans. But within moments, I recognized that blending in was not an option available to my colleagues of color. So I'm here tonight to say to my brothers and sisters in Congress and all around our country, I'm sorry, for I had never really understood, what privilege really means. It took a violent mob of insurrectionists and a lightning bolt moment in this very room. But now I know. Believe me, I really know.
How do you feel about that a year later?
It's still hard to listen to, Kathy. Considering what our community has gone through in our country in light of the George Floyd killing and its aftermath and the January 6th experience, it's been a life-changing couple of years for many of us, and I'm no different. And I think about that daily, about really understanding what life is like every day for so many of our fellow Americans who suffer. There are silver linings from every traumatic experience, individually, collectively, and for me, there are some extraordinary silver linings from that day that remind me about the fragility of our country, about the privilege that I have enjoyed my entire life for so many reasons, and my responsibility to do what I can in ways big and small, as long as I possibly can, to improve lives for others.
We reached out to the Minnesota Republican delegation about January 6th and some of other media outlets and have heard nothing. House GOP leaders say we need to move forward. There have been efforts to whitewash or downplay what happened. Can you have a rational conversation with your Republican colleagues about this and the view of many that President Biden was not the victor in 2020?
Kathy, I have those conversations regularly. The sad part of it is that they're private conversations, and the public positions of many of my colleagues, unfortunately, are incongruent with their valid feelings. And that saddens me. There is a spirit in politics, of course, in which self-preservation seems to always take precedence over principle. And we're seeing that play out right now. We're all human beings. Things of which we are ashamed, we wish to forget. We wish others to forget. We wish to sugarcoat, ignore with the hopes that people dismiss it. And that is a very intentional strategy, I'm afraid, by many of my colleagues. What troubles me the most, Kathy, is that there were the perpetrators of January. Many of them are being prosecuted and imprisoned and punished right now. But equally important is the discussion about the enablers, the people that made this possible. And it sickens me that there will be hundreds of people likely going to prison for January 6th. But those that actually inspired them, including, most importantly, the former president himself, the fact that he continues his big lie, he perpetuates this misinformation, those that will pay the price for it are imprisoned. And those that inspired it continue to walk the halls of the Congress and walk the halls of Mar-a-Lago.
Is there a way to reach the millions of people who still sympathize with the folks who overran the Capitol? Some deny the video shows what it does. More than half of Republicans surveyed believe that this January 6th rioters were protecting democracy. How do you reach those people?
Kathy, the sad truth is we have what I would call an angertainment industry, a thriving angertainment industry that thrives on division. attracts eyeballs by stoking fears. I read yesterday that the new GOP chairman in Minnesota called January 6th, quote, some type of a disturbance, which is such a absence of fact. Democrats and Republicans who were there that day know what happened. The dissipation and erosion of that truth by my colleagues is disheartening. Again, the spirit of self-preservation seems to take precedence over the principle, and I don't know how we can reach people whose hearts are hardened, who have bought into lies. I think the only way to solve it is to encourage people to look beyond their current singular sources of information and to hope and pray and encourage my colleagues across the aisle to at least recognize that we're in this together and that fact and truth should at least be the cornerstones of public service in America.
You touched on this a little bit during our conversation, but I'm curious. There was the recent National Public Radio poll that showed 6 in 10 people, 6 in 10 Americans believe democracy is in crisis in this country. As an elected official, what do you think is the state of our democracy?
Cathy, it's complicated because the truth is our institutions remain viable, remain populated generally with extraordinary public servants of all kinds of political perspectives, and that makes me optimistic. Yes, we are in crisis, there's no question. But a crisis does not mean that the bitter end is forthcoming or that we will devolve worse. It is a moment to reflect. It's a moment to take a look at what countries around the world are seeing when they look at the United States of America. I think that we will persevere. I believe that there are principled conservatives that remain that recognize their responsibility. It saddens me that some of the best ones are retiring or will probably lose their jobs for showing principle and courage. And I think if fellow Americans do a little reflection during this new year, we'll all conclude that there's something more important than policy and politics, and that is preservation. So I'm optimistic, and I'm going to do everything I can to encourage that, invest in that. And I have to say, Cathy, that I'm bringing people together right now. I have a series called Common Grounds, where we bring Democrats and Republicans to the same table with a facilitator, a former marriage counselor, I should say, who literally creates and facilitates a dynamic where we get to know each other, we learn from each other, and we end up becoming respectful of one another. So I know it's possible. I do see a path forward, and I'm going to continue to do my best to inspire other people to spend some time with those who see things awfully differently, and we'll recover and we'll persevere.
I'm going to leave it there. Representative, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Cathy. Keep the faith.
We've been talking to DFL Congressman Dean Phillips. He was reliving his experience at the U.S. Capitol 1 year ago today on January 6th, 2021. Later on Minnesota Now, we'll revisit a conversation I had earlier today with former Republican Congressman Vin Weber.